Okay, so this little bit of a lecture is the payoff for everything you've watched up until this point, where we're going to be doing a direct comparison between the colonial culture that developed in the Chesapeake versus the colonial culture that developed in New England. So the previous bits were giving you kind of the background, and this is the hardcore stuff. So if you're keeping notes, you're going to want to have two columns, one that says Chesapeake, one that says New England. Kind of set yourself up a table that will allow you to do this kind of direct comparison, because it's going to matter in the end. This whole set of lectures was inspired by an old book by David Hackett Fischer, who's kind of a big name in American history, called Albion's Seed. And in Albion's Seed, Fischer compares four different colonial cultures. He looks at New England, the Chesapeake, the Pennsylvania Quakers, and the Carolina Highlands, and looks at where the people in each of those areas came from, and therefore what kind of culture that they created. And he does kind of a direct side-by-side comparison in 25 different cultural areas. So he looks at things like architecture and religion and family and gender and all sorts of different things. What I have done for this lecture is obviously pared it down to just two colonial cultures. We're only looking at New England and the Chesapeake, and limited it to 5 areas where the difference is both quite clear and where you can see remnants of those cultures pretty clearly throughout the time period of history that we're talking about, so up through the Civil War. I don't really recommend that you run out and read Albion's Seed, because the style of history that was being written in the late 80s was just super boring. It's basically a list of stuff, and it's not worth your time. When you go to graduate school, you can read that book if you want to. So the first of the ways that we're going to compare the Chesapeake and New England is in the idea of this word liberty or freedom. The words technically mean kind of different things, but it's easier for us to kind of conflate them because they certainly overlap a lot. And so clearly, by the time we get to the Revolution, we're very interested in freedom. We're interested in liberty. It's something that the nation is founded on. It turns out that different people in the colonies were talking about different things. When somebody in the Chesapeake used the word liberty or used the word freedom, he was talking about an individual's right to control himself and others. So that's one person who gets to decide, where do I want to live? What kind of job do I want to have? How am I going to earn money? How am I going to spend money? Who am I going to marry? All of those kinds of personal decisions were a part of having this individual liberty. That sounds pretty familiar to us today. What was different in the Chesapeake was an idea that liberty was finite. There are certainly limits to liberty, and that liberty can be taken away from somebody. We don't like to think about losing freedom, but it was just a normal thing that a guy could buy another person's freedom, right? That's what happens when you enslave somebody. You're buying their freedom and taking it to yourself. And that man who purchased people as slaves, that man who purchased indentured servants, that man who marries a wife, he is taking their freedom, becoming more free himself because he governs these other individuals. So a person can gain more freedom by taking away the freedom of others, which is kind of a weird concept. We don't think about one person really being more free because they control another person's freedom. But that's the way they thought about it in the Chesapeake. And the key for you to remember here is that freedom is something held by the individual. A person's freedom means that they have their own self-determination. In contrast, in New England, freedom or liberty is something that the community has. Remember how they're so focused on building a community, and they want that community to be able to govern itself. So when they set up Boston, they want Boston to be able to make laws for the people of Boston. But any individual in Boston who breaks those laws, even though they say, hey, I'm free, no, they have to follow the rules. So you get all these traditions of coercion and punishment in New England that are aimed at getting people to follow the rules of the community. What they really want in terms of freedom is the ability for the community to make those rules. It's not the king coming in, it's not a bishop coming in, it's not the pope coming in, it's not some random governor coming in and making laws. It's the people of the community making the laws for the community. So when you're thinking about liberty in New England, you've got to be thinking about the community. It's the group's right to legislate. So it's very much this idea of majority rule. If 51% of the population says you've got to get married by the time you're 17, well, you got to do it. Even if you're in that minority, you still have to follow the rules. Next up is speech, which I throw in just because it's fun. It's one of the things that we notice about people when we first meet them. We make so many judgments about just the way that they talk, what kind of an accent they have, what kind of vocabulary they use. And speech is surprisingly stable, so that if you travel to Virginia today, you will hear remnants of the accent that was brought over in the 17th century. And the same thing is true in New England. If you go out to New England, the people that were born and raised there have the same kind of an accent that was brought in the 17th century. The language that we associate with the South, with long vowels, soft R's, and kind of hillbilly vocabulary, that was how people in the south of England, particularly the upper classes, because upper classes create fashion, how they spoke in the 17th century. And so the example here is vocabulary usage from the 17th century, maybe not in this particular sentence, but the word howdy, tote, for carry, flapjack rather than pancake, bide a while, for staying, to come stay, you would bide. So this language that we kind of associate with the South backcountry was actually this kind of upper class English accent. It's the English who changed. There's this thing called the great vowel shift in the English accent, where they all suddenly started talking like they were on the BBC, and the Chesapeake held on to the old language. The Chesapeake and the American South held on to the old language. So if you hear people trying to recreate a Shakespearean accent, they sound more like they're from the American South than that they are from England. In New England, the people who came from East Anglia were already getting teased about their accents when they were in England. They called it a Norfolk whine was the name for the East Anglian accent. It was very nasal and added extra R's where they didn't belong, so you would hear them at the end of words like idea and operer. And then they would drop R's where they did belong. So that's where you get the kind of classic Massachusetts "pak the ka" idea, that you're leaving out those R's. As very nasalized accent. The other vocabulary element to the New England accent is, remember that this is a community that really values education, and what they're hearing from the pulpit is very fancy language, kind of this Latinized, and they know all this Greek, and they know all this stuff that they're throwing in very complicated sentences to make things sound extra holy and extra educated. And it meant that people would try to imitate this even if they didn't have that same kind of an education themselves. And so you get sentences written, this was written in a letter from someone to someone in the 17th century, like this one on the screen. If the whole conclave of hell can so compromise exadverse and diametrical contradictions as to compartmentalize such a multi-monstrous moffrey of heteroclites and quidclibates quietly, I trust I may say with all humble reverence They can do more than the Senate of heaven, which is basically to say, I don't think they can do it. They liked to use that kind of language, and so that became stereotypical of New England language, was this kind of overeducated overuse of big words and fancy sentence constructions. At the heart of community in both, all colonies, maybe in all human communities, at the heart of community is the family. But again, both the North and the South thought of family in different ways when they used the word family. In the Chesapeake, remember that they're coming from a largely aristocratic society where property is maintained through marriage and inheritance. Family becomes entwined with wealth and with status. And in a community like that, family, the extended family, becomes very important. So they want, if they've got a second cousin who's a judge, they want people to know, hey, that's my family member over there, the judge. That judge is in my family. They might not say, he's my second cousin twice removed. It's just like, my cousin, the judge. There's a great emphasis on extended relationships. People have close relationships with their cousins, with their distant aunts and uncles. So when they talk about their family, they're talking about everybody with this blood relation to them, not only their nuclear family. They might also use family to mean the people who are dependent on one household. So a husband, wife, the extended relations that live with them, and the servants and the enslaved people that live with them. So that could be a usage. The other thing to remember about a family in the Chesapeake is it was destabilized because of the very high mortality rates. There's a very high rate of infant and maternal mortality. There are a lot of things that kill young men. Most children who were born had lost one parent by the time they were 12, had lost both parents by the time that they were 18, which means that the Chesapeake family is very, very complicated. There are steps and halves and adopteds all over the place. So everybody is coming from some kind of a complex blended family, and that also leads to this definition as all these people are my family, this extended blood relations, and even in some cases then adopted relations and step relations. So family is broad and complicated in the Chesapeake. By contrast, in New England, when you talk about family, you're actually talking about a chosen religious connection. It's something called a covenanted family or a covenanted marriage, which meant that when a man and a woman were married, they made a contract with each other and with God to have children and raise them in a Christian way. It was that go forth and multiply thing from the Old Testament. So the community puts the emphasis on that marital relationship. And so kids were supposed to be, good to their parents. They're supposed to be obedient and loyal and everything. But the key family relationship was the marriage relationship, was the one that adults chose for themselves, rather than the relationships by blood that you get through basic reproduction. So when New Englanders talk about family, they're talking about a husband and wife and their children in this religious covenant, in this contract. And so you see many more individual nuclear families rather than the kind of extended, messy families that you see in the Chesapeake. And this is helped by the high survival rates in New England. This particular family that we're looking at, we do have a parental generation over here. I don't know why this guy is so tall. I don't know what's going on with this painting. But there's a grandparents' generation. There's, let's see, I'm not even sure that we have a mother in here. I think this is the mother. I think that's a grandfather. I don't know why this guy's so tall. But then all of these kids, this is the point I wanted to make, all the kids are from one mother and father. They're all surviving children. And that was much more common in New England, where you would have 8 or 10 children in a family that all survived. And so people are very focused on that family, husband, wife, children, not on the extended, blended, mixed up families as they were in the Chesapeake. Rank is a description of how one of the ways that society was organized, and a lot of times people feel like it corresponds to class in the modern world, but class has to do with the ways that people relate to the economy. It's very much an economic designation. As it says, it's a modern concept and a modern way of organizing society, and inherent in the idea of class is the conflict between groups, that the working class is against the middle class and the upper class is against the middle class. Rank was a way of ordering society that assumed coherence among the different groups, that there were people at the bottom of society and there were people at the top of the society and people in the middle, and they all worked together to form a whole society. So it wasn't that these groups fought against each other, but that they were part of a coherent whole. And the other thing is that while rank had economic consequences, rank didn't really have an economic definition. So where in class we're talking about how people make money or either create money for themselves or create money for the society, rank was more about how people were related to one another. Are they above somebody or below somebody? Are they in the governing part of society? Are they in the following part of society? Rather than worrying about that economic part. There were certainly economic ramifications, but that wasn't a part of the definition of rank. So in two colonial groups that we're looking at, rank is the same concept in both New England and in the Chesapeake, and it's maintained through a system of what's called condescension and deference. And you're probably familiar with this use of the term deference. It's this idea that maybe you call your professors doctor or professor rather than calling them by their first names, because it's polite. It's this idea of appropriate behavior to someone on a higher rank than you are. Condescension, we in America tend to think of condescension as a bad thing, because in the act of condescension, you are placing somebody below you. Condescension is the appropriate behavior towards somebody of a lower rank. In America, we don't like to think about anybody being of a lower rank, so condescension becomes a bad thing purely by definition, because you don't want anybody to be lower than anybody else. So we don't like it when someone acts like we are lower than them. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, rank was a thing, and condescension was the appropriate way for a person of higher class to act, or of higher rank, to talk to somebody of lower rank. And everybody understood the rules in the same way that we might have internalized rules about gender that were in the process of overturning, perhaps, but we've internalized these social rules of behavior. People in the colonies also internalized these rules of behavior, the way that a person of lower rank was supposed to defer to the people above him or her, and the way that a person of higher rank was supposed to condescend and treat well the people below them on the social ladder. And this is what made rank hold society together, was that the people of higher rank were condescending and the people of lower rank were deferent, and it made the whole society congeal. This illustration, this is actually an English illustration that you're looking at, is an illustration of what happens when these rules of rank were not followed appropriately. What's happening here is a bunch of lower ranked people, so peasants, are punishing a high-ranking person for not being condescending. A part of condescension was making sure that the lower class people had enough to eat, making sure that the lower orders were fed. And when this person was charging too high of a price for grain, he was not behaving appropriately toward the people below him. They they would call this a halter, but they've got a rope around his neck. They're going to try to probably not actually kill him, but they're going to pretend to kill him. It was a very frightening thing for him to have happen. They're beating him with this thing. I should know what it is, but I've forgotten. Saying various things about how inappropriately he is behaving. And this was seen as completely normal, this kind of riot, because these people don't have a vote. They don't have a political way to address their anger, and so they addressed it through riot in this way. That was also a part of this whole rank system. It's outside the economy to some extent. It's outside of politics to some extent. It is purely social in theory. So when we look at the colonies that we're studying, they have the versions of the same rank system. All of England had a similar system of ranking, but they had different balances of the different ranks. So in the Chesapeake, pretty much the entire social world of England was brought to the Chesapeake. Everything from the noble men who were given land, given titles, and then worked their land as an estate, just like they would have in England, all the way down to the very impoverished servants, and in America, the enslaved people as well. What is different in America is that the balance is off, because there are relatively few of these kind of middle groups, the smaller farmers, the merchants there are only a few of. Day laborers are more likely to be very small farmers. There are relatively few of them, so it almost becomes like an hourglass shape, where there are some very, very wealthy people, very few of kind of the middle groups of people, and then a very large group of indentured servants and enslaved Africans that are doing the labor for the nobility. So although the proportions are different from England, it is largely the same ranking system that they brought over. By contrast, in New England, they cut off the top and the bottom of the ranking system, because when the Puritans set up their colonies, they said, you can't bring over a title. Sure, you may be a duke in England, but you can't be a duke in New England. The most you can be is gentry. You can have some land. You can be a community leader because you've got 200% of the land of other people, but you don't have thousands of percents more. They also didn't allow unemployed servants or enslaved people to come into the colonies. So in Virginia, a servant could simply go over and hire themselves out, or Africans could be brought in and sold into slavery. In New England, servants have to be brought in. There has to be an employer who goes somewhere and says, you come be my servant, or goes to a slave market and purchases somebody and brings that person in. And this meant that there were many fewer indentured servants and slaves in New England than there were in other parts of the Americas. So what that meant is that in New England there was a very rough equality. And clearly it's not absolute equality. There are some people at the top, some people that are at the bottom. But the very, very rich are excluded and the very, very poor are excluded. So what you're left with is just those groups in the middle. And finally, we're going to talk about gender. And for many years in American history, 20 years in American history, gender was code for talking about women. That's not actually how I'm using it here. I'm talking about gender as the social and behavioral roles that are based on sex. Because you are presenting female, you should behave in XYZ ways. Because you are presenting male, you should behave in this way over here. So gender is a broader term that has to do with social expectations based on physical sex, rather than men did this, women did that. And this might make a little more sense later on. See, in the Chesapeake, because of the very high mortality rates in the Chesapeake, there's a lot of focus on childbirth. There's a lot of focus on having children, and that's the most important thing. If you are biologically female, the most important thing was that you bore children. They didn't really care if you were educated, if you had an occupation, if you lived with a man monogamously, if that man was African, or if that man was white. There wasn't a lot of concern, especially early on. What was important is that you were bearing children. And so there is a wide range of female experience. So there are indentured servants who become landowners. They're female, like they marry somebody, they get widowed, they suddenly own land. There are interracial relationships. There are women who become highly educated. There are women who run plantations, and there are women who work as sex slaves, and there are women who are oppressed and never educated. So there's this huge variety of female experience, because the only thing they cared about was, are you having a baby or not? That's like the main focus, the main purpose is have a baby, have a baby, have a baby. What else you're doing, we're going to ignore that. The other piece that comes out of Chesapeake culture is, remember that this is a hugely hierarchical society, and there are very few places for men to actually become leaders. There are a few government positions. There are very, very large estates that one person controls. And so that's the patriarch of the family, the oldest man of the family controls this estate, and then all of his sons and nephews and brothers have to be subordinate to him. They've lost their freedom to that patriarch to some extent. And what that sets up is a society where the men are expected to be leaders, they're expected to be assertive, and they don't have a way to express that. They can't move into those leadership roles. And so physical aggression becomes a very important part of maleness, of expressing maleness, is to be physically aggressive. And given the focus on reproduction, that physical aggression often becomes sexual violence. So there's a really serious rape culture going on in the Chesapeake in the colonial era, because men pretty much are encouraged to have sex with any female that's not above their rank. So it might be their friend's sister, it might be an enslaved woman, it might be an indentured servant. It's kind of like whoever they feel like they can get away with having sex with, they were kind of encouraged to do that. Going along with that is then a culture of feminine subordination, this sense that sex and reproduction are the things that women are for, and therefore this kind of sexual aggression against them is part of somehow maintaining the society, rather than the exploitation that we see it as today. So women were acculturated to be subordinate and to be protected. In general, were made to believe that they couldn't really decide things for themselves, and that the men were the leaders, that it was their freedom, that men were gaining their liberty by taking away the freedom from the women. So not a really pleasant place to be. You will read about some women in the colonies that became very powerful and that were able to kind of self-actualize. But for the most part, women were asked to live in subordinate roles, to be mothers, and pretty much nothing beyond mothers and laborers. Things are slightly better in New England. It's still not like a great haven of women's liberation. But the focus in New England, kind of the social focus, was on spirituality. If the social focus in the Chesapeake was on reproduction, in New England it was on being a godly person, on being able to achieve salvation. And for all their faults, the Puritans did believe in the equality of male and female souls, that both men and women were equally able to achieve salvation and to become members of church congregations. And so because women were believed to have this degree of spiritual equality, there was also some degree of legal equality given to women. So as I believe it talks about in your textbook, women were protected from both physical and verbal abuse. They had rights to sign contracts. They had some legal rights of inheritance. So women were not entirely excluded from personhood in New England in the way that they were in the Chesapeake. However, that spiritual focus also imposed a really strict gender structure on New England society. Male people in the Bible were given the role of God's mouthpiece. Supposedly because Adam got the job of naming all the animals, that gave men the dominion over everything else, over the animals, over the women, over the children. So within the Puritan family, men were seen as God's mouthpiece in the family. He had the authority. And then women were supposed to be the ones who said, yes, dear, we'll get that done. So while they are given some spiritual authority, some spiritual equality, women are supposed to be followers. There's some famous quotes, the man is the head of the woman, women should be silent in church, things like this, that they used to support this idea that women ought to be followers. The women also were educated, and that could get them into trouble. And we will talk later on about Anne Hutchinson and how her education and speaking up in what she believed in got her into a great deal of trouble. So there is this sense that men should be leaders, women should be followers, but there's more difficulty with women leaders than you might expect, I guess. So what we have is two very different colonial cultures that begin in the early 17th century in North America. Even though they are both English colonies, there are some really significant differences between them. And those differences continue to develop. It's not like they start talking to each other and they all become friends and they get along. There's a lot of rivalry among the colonies and a lot of recognition of those cultural differences as they developed. So when we get to the Civil War, and when I get to the Civil War lecture, I will tell you this again. Remember how in the South they really like this idea of individual liberty, and in the North they really like that idea of majority rule and community government. these cultural differences maintain arguably right through to the present day, that we still are having these kinds of fights over whether it should be one person deciding something for himself or whether it should be the community making those decisions, about what are appropriate gender roles, about how should we address people of different ranks in society. So right from the very beginning of this American experiment here, we have a cultural conflict getting set up, and one of the great puzzles of American history was how to both respect these different cultures and bring them together into one nation.